Hello, and welcome to this final installment in my retrospective series on the first 6 Saw films. All 5 sections of this video will contain spoilers for the first 6 Saw films.
You are predators, but today you become the prey, and it is your own pound of flesh that I demand.
This is your fault!
The scale before you is your only path to freedom.
So I mentioned in my Saw 3 video that I think that entry is the most violent of the first 6. This 6th film is really the only one where if somebody challenged me on that and pointed to this one and said this one was more violent, I would consider that fair. Personally, I still think Saw 3 is the most violent overall. That said, I will acknowledge that I think this opening trap is probably the most violent trap out of all the films. And we have reached a point in this series where a lot of the gore is more gratuitous than it is in service of a larger story. Though I would probably argue it does serve one of the main themes of the series, that being suffering and the good and bad aspects of suffering. Anyways, there is a component of this trap that I like, though it does rest somewhat on my personal interpretation of the trap. As someone that prefers to believe John's claims that he wants everyone to survive these games, I am of the belief that there is a way for both of these people to get out of this trap. And I believe the way for them both to get out is to have the scale perfectly balanced. And what is the one and only way they could achieve that? By neither of them putting any weight on either side of the scale. I think the twisted, poetic irony of this trap is that it turns Simone and Eddie's predatory behavior on themselves. And I would just take that a step further by suggesting that had they both acted selflessly and thus not mutilated themselves, they both would have survived relatively unharmed. You know, the screws would have still dug in a little bit, to try and pressure them into playing the game. But other than that, I think they both would have escaped pretty much unharmed. At least according to John's design. Who's to say how Hoffman would have reacted to that, if that's what had happened?
Who will offer the most flesh in order to save their life? The choice is yours. I'm not dying for you, fish!
Speaking of which, here we can see him listening to that game. This is quickly establishing that he is getting some enjoyment out of listening to this suffering and dying.
Lindsay.
Detective Hoffman?
Perez. It was my call, Detective. I knew the jigsaw wasn't working alone, but until I knew for certain who was helping him, I couldn't guarantee her well-being.
Similar to Eric Matthews being in Saw 3 and Saw 4, this was another surprise. I remember watching Saw 5 and thinking it was kind of ridiculous that what happened to Perez would have killed her. So I was a fan of this reveal that she had actually survived for a couple of reasons.
Well, I didn't know who I could trust. What else have you been keeping from me?
Now, what is pretty clear when watching this movie is that Perez and Erickson clearly already suspect Hoffman. The question is why, though, after the events of Saw 5 ended with all of the evidence pointing to Strom, even if they had a hard time believing this man they knew was capable of this stuff, what would be the reason for them suspecting Hoffman specifically? And if you watched the director's cut and waited around for the post-credits scene, that's where we get the answer to this. And I will be covering that in the next section.
As a human being, do you like how brutality feels, Mark?
Let's be honest. You want him to suffer just as much as I do.
So this scene is my favorite of this whole movie. In just this one scene, you get a real sense of the dynamic here at the end of John's life. And it gives us our first and only real look at the relationship between Hoffman and Amanda. There's clearly quite a bit of antagonism between them, which is yet another thing I wanted to see further explored. What this scene always made me wonder was what Hoffman's reaction to John recruiting Amanda would have been. Saw 5 reveals that Hoffman was the first person that John recruited into helping him. At first, Hoffman seems to agree simply because of a lack of options, yet we know he later develops a taste for this work. My question here was always, did Hoffman develop this appreciation before Amanda was brought on board or after? And in either case, you could see why Hoffman would be unhappy with Amanda being brought into this. If he's still helping John at that point because he's being blackmailed into helping him, then he's obviously not going to be crazy about the idea of bringing somebody else in on this that is going to know all about the crimes he's committing. On the other hand, if he's actually now looking forward to the idea of taking over the mantle of Jigsaw, you can see how he might be unhappy with the idea that John chose somebody else to also do that.
Live or die. The choice is yours.
It's not my game.
Okay, so let's talk about the twists. The way I see it, there's really just 2 big ones. One for the trap storyline, which is specific to this film only, and that is the reveal about William's family, while the other twist is the one that affects the overarching story, and that is the reveal about what the letter said and Amanda's involvement in Jill losing Gideon. I'll start with that first one. I think the idea of this twist is a pretty good one. Unfortunately, though, I feel like they kind of cheated on this one. It would be one thing if you had the mother and the son, and, you know, they're obviously leading you to believe that that's his family. And then if you had some other random person that you didn't understand why they were there or who they were, but instead they had his sister be this reporter who was like covering Jigsaw specifically, who also didn't share his last name, and who he apparently calls Babe.
Hey, babe. Good. Listen, I am so sorry, but I can't make dinner.
Anyways, my point is that Pamela serves a purpose in this story that is completely separate from William, and that is mainly to get a hold of Jill and get her the copy of the letter. And it just seems too coincidental that she also happens to be this guy's sister. It also seems a little strange to me, the idea that in this world where, you know, this is happening, that Jigsaw would just refer to Pamela as William's family instead of just saying his sister or Pamela.
If you don't reach the end before the timer hits 0, you will never see your family again.
I have family too, so I can empathize with his argument.
And it just feels like he only refers to her that way specifically so that we, the audience, won't see that coming. So again, while I like the idea of this twist, where you have this mother and son that you think are William's family, end up being the family of the man that he let die, I do like that idea. I just feel like it's drastically undermined by the cheap way that they kind of mislead us about it. There are ways they could have done it without cheating, basically. Now, as for the overarching twist, I am a huge fan of that. It is once again a huge part of what I see as what this story could have been about if it had concluded a certain way. But I'm going to put a pin in that until the review and analysis section. Okay, so there is a huge difference between the theatrical version and the director's cut. A big criticism I have of this film is that there are two halves of this movie that have almost nothing to do with each other. Those being the trap storyline, and the other half being the overarching story. Now, the one way that those two things do come together in the director's cut is that John's plan for Hoffman puts him in this trap and in this situation where his fate is linked to the decision of whether or not the mother and son will forgive William. In the director's cut, when the switch gets flipped down to die, that's what arms the jaw trap on Hoffman.
No, Brad! You killed my father, you motherfucker!
As well as what kills William. And what I really like about this is that Hoffman is revealed through this movie as being someone that wants to see people suffer, specifically people he wants to see punished, and he is all about revenge and not forgiveness. So by placing Hoffman in this trap, he is now in a situation where he actually has to root for the opposite of what he's normally hoping to see happen. If they forgive William as John wants them to, then Hoffman will survive. But if they give in to Hoffman's path of revenge, the idea is that that would be the end of Hoffman as well. I talked in my Saw 3 video about how John's fate was linked to this philosophical battle over whether Jeff would choose forgiveness or revenge. And by having Hoffman placed in this situation, John has done the same thing for Hoffman's fate. Now in the theatrical version, again, for reasons I do not understand, they set it up so that what happens to Hoffman has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on in that game. They weirdly CGI this pin that comes out of the device when Jill shuts the door, even though we never see her tie a cable to the door or anything like that. And so not only does it rob the scene of that interesting dilemma, it also makes it so that the trap storyline of this film has nothing to do with the other half of this film. The other major difference between these two versions is the post-credit scene. The theatrical version does not contain that, whereas the director's cut does. And that scene is basically on the night that Amanda and John die. After she has read the letter, Amanda goes to where they're keeping Corbett, Jeff and Lynn's daughter, and she speaks to her through the keyhole. And she tells her not to trust the man who saves her, which, as we know, is Hoffman. And so the implication here is that this is why Perez and Erickson were suspecting Hoffman this whole time. And it was sort of Amanda's revenge from beyond the grave. Why this was deleted? Okay, so this one is another one that is complicated to review, particularly because the two storylines of this movie are so disconnected from each other. Because half of this movie I really like, while the other half, which is the trap storyline, I really couldn't care less about. The merry-go-round scene, I think, is an interesting idea, and I appreciate what they were going for there, but without knowing anything about these characters, the whole thing feels very hollow, and I'm also not sure that I really buy the behavior there. But yeah, ultimately, I get nothing of value out of that half of the story. And don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not saying that the other half, the half that I do like, I'm not saying that that half is perfect. There is some weak acting and dialogue in that half. I just think the story is very interesting as far as how it expands on what came before and what it seems to set up for a finale. So yeah, all in all, I think this one isn't quite as bad or as weak as Saw 5 was, but I think it's kind of close. And so for the series to have had these two weaker entries, followed by the absolute atrocity that is Saw 3D, it is absolutely understandable to me why the later half of this series has such a bad reputation. I think there are aspects of Saw 5 and 6 that are underappreciated, specifically regarding the ongoing narrative and the overarching themes. But Saw 4 is really the only one out of this last half that I really don't think deserves its bad reputation. And the tragedy for me has always been that if the final chapter had been good, then I think that would have drastically affected the perception people have of this series. Okay, so now we can get into what I've been wanting to talk about this entire series. And that is what I see this story being about. With this film revealing the true extent of Hoffman's nature, as well as the role he played in Amanda's behavior, it really brought what I see as the overall religious allegory of this series to a new level. Now, before I start comparing John Kramer to God, I do feel the need to clarify something. I remember having a conversation with my brother in recent years about all of this, and I remember him saying to me that it kind of sounded like I was saying John was the good guy and he was right in everything that he was doing. And that's when I realized that I had been failing to make a very important distinction. I do believe that in the context of the story, as a religious allegory. That is not the same thing as me saying that if somebody like John Kramer existed in the real world and did the things that he did, I would absolutely not consider them a good person or somebody to root for or believe in or anything like that. Nothing gives a human being the right to do those things to another human being, no matter how pure their motivation may or may not be. That said, again, in the context of the story, as a religious allegory, I absolutely do feel that John Kramer is the protagonist of this overall story. And I absolutely believe that he is a representation of God. He's this figure with these intricate, thought-out plans in which he insists that people make their own choices, while at the same time subjecting them to suffering that he hopes will improve them. Meanwhile, you have Hoffman, who starts out as an ally of John's, but eventually becomes essentially his nemesis because of his much more cynical view of humanity. Hoffman doesn't seem to believe that people can be redeemed, and that the people that they are testing do not deserve a chance, and instead deserve to suffer and die. And so when John chooses Amanda, one of these people that Hoffman views as unworthy, there's an envy there reminiscent of Lucifer's jealousy of humanity. And so then what does Hoffman do? In my mind, he immediately begins trying to corrupt Amanda and trying to prove to John that he's wrong about her, and by extension, everyone else.
Amanda will fail you. We'll see.
He tries to lead her astray and away from John's teachings, and he succeeds in convincing her to sin against him and ultimately deny him.
He can't hear you. He doesn't even know you're there.
I'll tell you, she hasn't changed because nobody fucking changes. Nobody is reborn. It's all bullshit. It's all a fucking lie. And I'm just a pawn in your stupid games.
Amanda has the choice to simply confess to John what she did and have faith that he will forgive her. But she doesn't have that faith. Also, it may be worth pointing out that another part of this religious allegory is that John loses his only son. So everything I just said in the last section is what I expected to see resolved and to be central to the final chapter. To me, there was still this really interesting story to be told about this conflict between John and Hoffman, and how Amanda was this crucial component to that, where they were waging this battle over her soul. Aside from that, I also wanted to go deeper into whether or not John anticipated the possibility of Hoffman escaping that trap. I also wanted to know what he was referring to in Saw 6 when he tells Jill that when this is all over, he'll provide a way out for her. It seems strange to me that he says that to her, and then his plan was apparently to have her put this dangerous killer in this trap and then not get arrested by police for doing that. And I also wanted to know if there was anybody else that John had recruited into the situation and what their roles were meant to be, as well as what their dynamic between the other accomplices were. All of these things and the things that I've mentioned in this section of the last 5 videos, and so much more, are things that I address in my Saw 7 rewrite. As I announced at the start of this series, it was my goal to have all of these videos and that Saw 7 rewrite released by the time Spiral came out. That is obviously not going to happen at this point. Unfortunately, these videos were far more time-consuming than I had anticipated. But now that these videos are done, I will be focusing the bulk of my attention on getting this Saw 7 video format done. And I feel fairly confident that I can get that done and released before the end of the month. So yeah, it is my hope that anybody that has been watching these will come back for that. If you are willing to check that out and you have not yet subscribed, please do so that you can be notified when that is released. But until then,
Game over.
Hello there. If you'd like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive, just click the circle to subscribe. In the meantime, you can click either of the 2 boxes to check out other content from this channel. Or don't. The choice is yours.